kingdoms rose, before beasts ruled, there was a man who saw it all. They took his title, they tore his cloak, they dragged him away with chains and silence. But he carried something they could not break, a fire born not of flesh, but of God. They renamed him, they re-educated him, they fed him from royal tables. But he remembered who he was. In the city of idols, he refused to kneel. In the palace of sorcery, he did not speak their lies. He learned their language, but kept his own truth. He wore their robes, but bore a different spirit. Among the learned, he was set apart. Some kneel to survive, others burn to stand. He spoke what others feared, he saw what others denied. The first child of his mother, Joseph, was the long-awaited answer to years of silent prayers and aching hope. His birth broke through the shadows of barrenness, a sign that God had not forgotten Rachel. For so long, Rachel had watched her sister Leah cradle one child after another, while her own arms stayed empty. But one day, God remembered her. He opened her womb, and she gave birth to a son. With joy overflowing, she named him Joseph, saying, "May the Lord add yet another son to me." Joseph's birth brought laughter back into Rachel's tent. Jacob's heart swelled with love for the little boy, the son of his old age and of his beloved Rachel. Wherever Joseph went, warmth seemed to follow. He was a child of promise, a living reminder that waiting on God is never in vain. Jacob's life had not been easy. He had known long years of wandering and hard work. He had fled from home with nothing but a staff in his hand, escaping his brother Esau's anger. He had served his uncle Laban for years, watching over sheep through cold nights and under the burning sun. But through every season of hardship, God had been shaping him, just as he would one day shape Joseph. When Joseph was born, it felt as though every weary night had finally found its meaning. Each time Jacob held his son, he saw more than a child. He saw God's faithfulness. The same God who had guided him on lonely roads and turned loss into blessing had now placed this gentle boy in his arms. Joseph's laughter filled their home like morning light, chasing away the shadows of yesterday. To Jacob, he wasn't just a son. He was proof that God's promises always bloom, no matter how long the waiting seems. But joy and sorrow often walk side by side. Joseph was still young when his mother, Rachel, passed away. Old enough to remember her smile, but too young to understand why she never came back. He could still see her soft hands fixing his little cloak in the morning, hear her laughter calling his name, and remember her gentle voice praying beside him at night. Rachel had waited so long for him. He was her miracle, her answered prayer. She loved him with the deep, unshakable love that only a mother who has once known barrenness can understand. She told him stories about God's goodness and patience, how his light always finds a way through the dark. Sometimes she would lift him high and whisper, "You are God's gift to me, my Joseph." As Joseph grew, her faith lived on in him. The way he spoke kindly, the way he listened before answering, the quiet strength in his eyes, all of it reflected his mother's heart. He was thoughtful beyond his years. While others hurried through their chores, Joseph took his time, gentle with the sheep and patient with the ones that strayed. Sometimes he would look up at the sky, wondering if his mother could see him. And when the breeze passed through the fields, he would smile, as if he had heard her voice again. Rachel's prayers had shaped him long before he understood what prayer meant. Her faith had left a mark deeper than words, a quiet trust in God that would one day carry him through both pain and purpose. Jacob saw all this in his son, and perhaps that was why he loved Joseph so deeply. Not just for who he was, but for the peace of Rachel that still lived in him. Every time Joseph laughed, it was as though Rachel's laughter echoed again in their home. But somewhere deep within, Jacob sensed a truth he could not explain, that this gentle boy who brought light into his life would one day walk through deep shadows. The one who loved deeply would also be wounded deeply. What Jacob was yet to know was that yet even then, God would be with him, turning every wound into wisdom and every valley into victory. Years passed, and Joseph blossomed into a young man whose presence carried a quiet grace. At 17, his days were often spent beneath the wide, open sky, helping his father tend the family's flocks. He did so with a willing heart, and not out of duty, but love. He worked alongside his older brothers, the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's other wives. Though they shared blood, their hearts were not always aligned. Joseph's honesty often stirred unease among them. When he saw them stray, he could not pretend not to notice. He would tell his father, not from pride, but from a place of truth. And with each passing day, their resentment deepened, shadowing the innocence that Joseph carried so easily. Jacob, growing old and tender-hearted, held Joseph close to his heart. The boy was the child of his old age, a living memory of Rachel, the love he had lost, but never forgotten. In Joseph's eyes, Jacob saw a reflection of that love, and his heart softened every time he looked at him. To honor that affection, Jacob had a robe made for his son, a garment of many colors, woven with threads that caught the light and shimmered with beauty. It was more than a gift. It was a father's way of saying, "You are precious to me." But love shown to one can sometimes be felt as lack by another. When Joseph's brothers saw the robe, its colors seemed to speak a language they could not bear to hear. Each thread reminded them of their father's unequal love, and envy began to take root. Quiet at first, then growing wild and thorned within their hearts. Still, Joseph remained gentle and unguarded. One night, God gave him a dream, one so vivid, so alive, that he woke with wonder. At dawn, he shared it eagerly with his brothers, how their bundles of grain bowed low before his. But instead of marvel, he met their silence. Their jealousy deepened, and the warmth in their eyes faded further away. Soon another dream came. This time the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed before him. When he told it, even Jacob paused, startled by its meaning. "What kind of dream is this, my son?" he asked softly. "Will your mother, your brothers, and I bow before you?" Yet, though Jacob spoke with care, his heart held the dream close. He had walked long enough with God to know that some dreams are not born of pride, but of divine purpose. The brothers, however, could see only favor where they longed for fairness. Their hearts grew colder. Days later, Jacob sent them to pasture the flocks near Shechem. When they had been gone for some time, he called Joseph. "Your brothers are pasturing near Shechem," he said. "Go, see how they are doing, and bring word back to me." Joseph nodded, his voice bright with eagerness. "I'm ready to go, Father." And so he set out from Hebron, his robe catching the sunlight as the wind brushed past. Each color seemed to dance, innocent and full of promise, unaware of the storm waiting ahead. In Shechem, he wandered through open fields, calling out for his brothers. A man found him and asked what he sought. "I'm looking for my brothers," Joseph replied. "Do you know where they've gone?" "They've moved on from here," the man said. "I heard them say they were heading to Dothan." Joseph thanked him and turned toward Dothan, not knowing that every step he took was leading him closer to the dream God himself had planted in his heart. He did not see that love and betrayal would soon weave together. For even in the hands of envy, God's plan was quietly unfolding a story that would one day reveal that what man designed for harm, God designed for good. The afternoon sun glowed softly over the hills of Dothan, gilding the edges of the fields where the brothers watched their flocks. Then, in the shimmer of the distance, they saw Joseph walking toward them, his robe of many colors rippling like light itself. "Here comes the dreamer," one of them murmured, his voice rough with memory and envy. The name once spoken in jest now carried a bitterness none could hide. The robe, the dreams, their father's love, it was all too much to bear. Another brother's words cut through the air. "Let's finish this. We'll throw him into one of these pits and tell father a wild beast took him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams." But Reuben, the eldest, felt the tremor of conscience stir within him. He looked at his brothers, their anger and their desperate longing to be seen. Quietly he said, "Let's not take his life." His tone was calm. "We can leave him in the pit." He spoke of it as a compromise, but in his heart he hoped he could return later and bring the boy home. He turned away, concealing the ache that came with his thought. For in the shadow of envy, love often has to whisper. When Joseph reached them, his face lit with the innocent joy of one coming to his brothers. He had no reason to fear. Not yet. But before his greeting could leave his lips, hands seized him. The world blurred into shouts and dust. They tore the robe from him, the beautiful woven robe their father had given with love and pride. As the fabric was stripped away, Joseph felt something deeper being torn too, the quiet bond of family, the trust of brotherhood. He looked from one face to another, confusion spilling into fear. Why are they doing this? No one answered. In silence, they lifted him and threw him into a dry well. The sound of falling stones followed him down until everything stilled. At the bottom of the pit, the air was cool and still. The light above flickered through the narrow opening like a distant promise. Joseph sat in the dust, trembling. His heart raced between disbelief and sorrow. How could love turn to this? His thoughts drifted to his father, the gentle voice, the kind eyes that had once told him he was chosen for something great. Then to his mother, whose lullabies had spoken of a God who never leaves his own. "Are you here too, God?" Joseph whispered. The words broke softly in the silence, and though no voice answered, peace, faint but real, settled over him. Meanwhile, above him, his brothers sat down to eat, their laughter uneasy. Then, in the distance, they saw a line of camel merchants on their way to Egypt, carrying spices and balm. Judah's eyes followed them thoughtfully. "What good will come from harming him?" he said. "Let's sell him instead. He is still our brother, after all." There was a moment of quiet. Then the others nodded. It felt easier, less cruel, but their hearts knew the truth. They pulled Joseph from the pit. For a heartbeat, hope rose in him. Perhaps they had changed their minds. Perhaps this nightmare was ending. But instead of an embrace, there were strangers waiting. His wrists were bound and coins clinked into his brother's hands. 20 pieces of silver. That was the price of a brother's life. The caravan began to move, and Joseph, eyes wide with disbelief, was led away. The brothers watched as he grew smaller, then vanished in the haze of dust and sunlight. No words were spoken. Their silence was heavier than any chain. When Reuben returned and found the pit empty, he tore his clothes in anguish. "The boy is gone!" His cry broke against the stillness, echoing through the fields. That evening, They carried Joseph's robe back to their father, torn and soaked in goat's blood. "Father," they said gently, "we found this. Do you know if it's your son's?" Jacob's hands trembled as he reached for it. The fabric was familiar, the colors dulled but unmistakable. His voice broke. "It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him." The robe fell from his grasp as grief overtook him. He tore his garments and wept long into the night. No comfort could reach him. "I will mourn for my son until I join him," he whispered, his tears falling onto the same robe he once folded with love. But far from home, Joseph's journey was only beginning. The boy who once dreamed beneath Canaan's stars now walked the roads of Egypt alone, yet not abandoned. Every step, though painful, was guided by unseen hands. For what his brothers meant for harm, God was already shaping for good, weaving mercy through betrayal and purpose through pain. In the quiet of his heart, Joseph held on to that truth. He did not understand it yet, but one day, those same dreams that had divided them would become the bridge that healed them all. And beneath the vast Egyptian sky, the dreamer's heart whispered again, not in despair, but in hope. His story was far from over. It was only just beginning. Judah and Tamar. After Joseph was taken to Egypt, silence fell upon Jacob's house. Grief lingered in every corner. And Judah, unable to bear the weight of what they'd done, left home for a while. He journeyed south to Adullam, where he tried to begin again. There, he met a man named Hira, who became his friend. And in that land, Judah found a woman, the daughter of a man named Shua. He married her, and life seemed to move forward. Time passed, and they were blessed with children, 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. Each birth brought joy and laughter, yet deep beneath it all, Judah's heart remained unsettled. For no matter how far he wandered, the memory of his father's sorrow still echoed faintly within him. Years rolled by, and Judah's sons grew into men. When his firstborn, came of age, Judah found a young woman named Tamar, gentle and strong, to be his wife. But Er's heart was hardened, and his ways displeased the Lord. And so, in quiet judgment, God took his life. Grief visited Judah again, and though he did what was right by custom, he asked his second son, Onan, to marry Tamar and raise children in his brother's name. Onan refused to walk in honor. He too acted out of selfishness, and the Lord's hand was heavy upon him. Once more, Judah buried a son. Now only Shelah remained, still young and fragile in his father's eyes. Judah's voice trembled with caution as he said to Tamar, "Go back to your father's house. Wait there as a widow until Shelah is grown." But fear whispered in his heart, "What if I lose him too?" So Tamar went home and waited. Days turned to months, months to years, and still no message came. Then Judah's wife fell ill and died. When his mourning was over, he journeyed with his friend Hira to Timnah, where his shepherds were shearing sheep. Someone told Tamar, "Your father-in-law is going to Timnah." She heard it quietly, her heart steady but resolved, for she knew Shelah had grown, and yet no promise had been kept. With courage that few would understand, she set out to act, not from deceit, but from faith that justice and legacy still mattered. She took off her widow's garments, veiled her face, and sat by the roadside near the entrance of Enaim, a place where travelers passed on their way to Timnah. When Judah saw her, he did not recognize her. He mistook her for a harlot, for her face was covered, and in his loneliness, blinded by grief and weariness, he approached her. "What will you give me?" she asked gently. "A young goat from my flock," he replied. She looked at him, not with judgment, but with quiet wisdom. "Then give me something as a pledge until you send it," she said. "What shall I give you?" Judah asked. "Your seal," she said, "its cord, and the staff you carry." He handed them over, unaware that this moment, though born of brokenness, would one day become a bridge of redemption. That day, Tamar conceived. And when Judah left, she returned home, removing her veil and putting on again the garments of her waiting. Later, Judah sent his friend Hira to deliver the goat and retrieve his belongings, but no one could find the woman. The men of the place said, "There has never been such a woman here." Embarrassed, Judah said, "Let her keep them. We'll say nothing more." Months passed. Then word reached Judah. "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has acted shamefully. She is with child." Anger and sorrow rose within him. "Bring her out," he said. "Let her be punished." But as they brought her forward, Tamar sent a message. In her hands were the seal, the cord, and the staff. "The man who owns these things," she said, "is the father of my child." Judah's heart stilled. He looked at the items, the very symbols of his name, his word, his authority, and in that moment, the truth dawned on him. He had judged her wrongly. Quietly, with a voice full of humility, Judah said, "She is more righteous than I am, for I didn't keep my promise to her." From that day, Judah never again approached her. Time passed, and Tamar gave birth to twins. During the delivery, one child reached out his hand, and the midwife tied a scarlet thread around it. "This one came first," she said. But the child drew his hand back, and his brother pushed ahead. The midwife gasped, "What a breakthrough!" And so he was named Perez, meaning breaking out. His brother, marked with the scarlet thread, was named Zerah. And through Perez, the child born from a story of broken promises would one day come a line of kings, and generations later, the Savior of the world. Because even through human weakness, God's redemption was still at work, weaving mercy out of failure and light out of shadow. When Joseph arrived in Egypt, the world around him was vast and unfamiliar. The land was different, the language strange, and the faces around him unknown. He was far from his father's tent, far from the hills of Hebron, yet not far from God. Though Joseph had been sold as a servant, the Lord was with him. And in every small task he did, in sweeping the courtyards, in tending the storerooms, in serving at his master's table, there was a quiet excellence that could only come from the hand of God. Joseph's master, Potiphar, a high-ranking officer of Pharaoh's guard, soon noticed something remarkable about the young man. There was a calm wisdom in his eyes, a peace in his spirit, and a blessing that seemed to rest wherever he stood. And so, Potiphar began to trust him, first with small things, then with greater. In time, Joseph was placed in charge of everything Potiphar owned. The servants looked to him for direction. The storehouses flourished under his care. Even the fields seemed greener, the herds stronger, the home more at peace, because the favor of God was upon Joseph. Potiphar had no worries left, except to decide what meal to enjoy each day. Such was his confidence in Joseph's integrity and the God who guided him. But even in places of peace, temptation often finds its way in quietly. Joseph had grown into a strong and handsome young man, and before long, Potiphar's wife began to notice him. Her glances turned into words. "Come, be with me," she said one day, her tone coaxing. But Joseph stepped back, his voice gentle yet firm. "My master trusts me with everything in this house," he said. "There is nothing he has kept from me except you, for you are his wife. How could I do such a wrong thing and sin against God?" Her words returned again and again, day after day, but Joseph's heart remained steady. He avoided her presence, guarding not only his master's trust, but also his fellowship with God. For he knew, even here, in a foreign land, God was watching over him. Then, one quiet day, when the house was empty and sunlight streamed softly through the latticed windows, Joseph came in to do his work. But before he could leave, Potiphar's wife caught him by his cloak. "Come with me," she said again, her grip desperate, her intent unyielding. Joseph did not argue. He did not stay to explain. He simply tore himself free and ran, leaving the cloak in her hands, but keeping his purity before God. The moment was brief, but it would change everything. When she saw that he had escaped her, anger and humiliation filled her heart. She called out to the servants, her voice trembling, not with truth, but with fury. "Look what this Hebrew servant tried to do," she cried. "He came to make a fool of me, but I screamed, and he ran away, leaving his cloak beside me." And when Potiphar returned home, she repeated the story again, holding up the garment as false proof. A faithful man's cloak now turned into the very thing that would chain him. Yet even in this, the quiet thread of God's purpose was still being woven. For the path of the righteous is not always smooth, but it is always guided. And though Joseph's faithfulness would soon lead him to prison, God's presence would go with him there too, because the Lord was never absent. Not in the pit, not in the palace, not even in the shadows of false accusation. Every tear and every trial was part of the story of redemption being written by the unseen hand of God. When Potiphar heard his wife's account, anger clouded his judgment. Without pause or question, he believed her words and ordered Joseph to be thrown into the prison where the king's own prisoners were kept. In a single moment, the man once trusted with everything was stripped of his freedom and cast into darkness. The open skies he once worked beneath were replaced by cold stone walls and heavy iron doors. Yet even there, God's presence didn't leave him. Joseph had known rejection before from his own brothers, from those he served faithfully, but through every wound, one truth remained. God was still writing his story. In the silence of the prison, Joseph held on to that truth. His heart stayed humble and his hands diligent. The warden soon took notice. There was something uncommon about this young man, a quiet strength and a grace that brought order where there had been unrest. His presence carried peace, and even in chains, he worked with the excellence of a free man. So, the warden placed Joseph in charge of the other prisoners, trusting him completely. He no longer worried about the affairs of the prison, for Joseph saw to everything with fairness and wisdom. And once again, God's hand was upon him. Behind locked doors, his favor still found Joseph. His favor strengthened and prepared him for the day when every piece of his story would fit into the divine plan. Even in the deepest valley, Joseph's life whispered that God's purpose never fails, even when the path winds through pain. Some time had passed in the quiet of the palace prison. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker had fallen out of favor, and the king, angered by their missteps, had placed them in the same confinement where Joseph lived, under his watchful care in the household of the captain of the guard. The days were slow and heavy, yet Joseph moved among them with a gentle diligence, attending to their needs. Then one morning, as the first light crept through the prison bars, he noticed a shadow of worry etched on their faces. "Why do you look so troubled today?" he asked, his voice calm, tender. They exchanged glances, unease lingering in the air. "We both dreamed last night," said one, "but no one can tell us what they mean." Joseph's eyes softened. "Dreams are the language of God," he said. "Tell me what you saw." The cupbearer spoke first, his voice hesitant but filled with hope. "I saw a vine before me, with 3 branches budding and blossoming. Clusters of ripe grapes appeared, and I held Pharaoh's cup in my hand. I took the grapes and pressed the juice into the cup, then placed it in Pharaoh's hand." Joseph listened carefully, then smiled with quiet confidence. "The 3 branches represent 3 days," he explained. "In 3 days, Pharaoh will restore you to your position. You will once again serve him, as before. But when this comes to pass, remember me. Speak of me to Pharaoh, so that I may find favor and leave this place. I am a Hebrew, taken from my home unjustly, and I have done nothing to deserve this confinement." The baker watched closely, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "I dreamed too," he said. 3 baskets of bread sat upon my head. The top basket held pastries for Pharaoh, but birds came and ate them from the basket." Joseph's expression remained calm, his faith steady. "The 3 baskets also mean 3 days," he said softly. "In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift you up, but not to honor. You will be executed, and birds will feast upon what remains." 3 days passed as quietly as the dawn. Pharaoh celebrated his birthday with a grand feast, summoning all his officials. The cupbearer returned to his honored place, presenting Pharaoh's wine with grace and precision. But the baker met the fate Joseph had foretold. And yet, amidst the unfolding of God's plan, there was one absence of justice. The cupbearer, restored to favor, forgot the young Hebrew entirely. Joseph remained behind the prison bars, faithful still, his heart trusting that God's purpose would not be thwarted. Even in confinement, even in forgotten moments, God's hand was weaving the path forward. A path that would carry Joseph from the shadows of a prison cell to the heart of Egypt itself. 2 years had passed quietly, though the world around Egypt was restless. One night, Pharaoh, the king of all the land, dreamed a vision that stirred unease in his heart. He stood by the flowing Nile, watching as 7 cows, healthy and fat, rose gracefully from the river and began to graze in the lush marsh grasses. But then, from the same waters, 7 more cows appeared, thin, weak, and gaunt. They stood beside the fat cows, yet in a startling moment, they devoured them. Still, even after this strange feast, they remained as scrawny as before. Pharaoh awoke, shaken. Sleep eluded him, and soon he found himself dreaming again. This time the vision was of golden heads of grain, plump and ripe, growing in the fields. But then 7 more heads, shriveled and withered by the east wind, appeared and swallowed the healthy stalks. When he awoke a second time, he realized these dreams were more than mere sleep. They were messages that cried out for understanding. The next morning, his worry brought him to summon all the wise men and magicians of Egypt. Yet none could offer an explanation. Then the chief cupbearer spoke, remembering a young Hebrew man who had interpreted dreams in the palace prison years before. "There was a man among us," he said, "a slave of the captain of the guard, who revealed the meaning of dreams, and everything he predicted came true." Pharaoh immediately sent for Joseph. He was brought from the prison, cleaned and dressed for the king's presence. Standing before Pharaoh, Joseph bowed, his calm faith steady in the presence of the ruler, who trembled before the weight of what he had seen. "I had a dream," Pharaoh began, "and no one can interpret it. But I hear that you understand dreams." Joseph's voice was gentle, measured, and full of quiet assurance. It is not by my power to interpret, but God will give Pharaoh the understanding he seeks." So Pharaoh recounted both dreams, the cows and the grain, the feast and the famine. And Joseph listened carefully, the threads of God's plan clear in his mind. "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same," Joseph said. "God has revealed to you what is coming. 7 years of abundance will sweep across Egypt, filling the land with plenty. But they will be followed by 7 years of famine, so severe that the memory of prosperity will fade from the land. God has shown you these things not to frighten, but to prepare." Joseph's eyes met Pharaoh's, steady and certain. "Now, therefore, let Pharaoh seek out a discerning and wise man, and appoint him over the land of Egypt. Let him gather 1/5 of the produce during the 7 abundant years, and store it in cities and granaries. In this way, when the famine comes, the people will be saved, and the land will endure." And in that moment, Pharaoh saw not only the truth of the dreams, but the hand of God guiding the young Hebrew, the dreamer who had been betrayed and forgotten, yet remained faithful. In Joseph, Egypt would find wisdom, and in God's plan, no trial was wasted. Under the soft light of morning, the palace of Pharaoh stirred with quiet anticipation. Before the throne stood Joseph, calm and composed, his eyes steady yet humble. The years had shaped him. The boy who once dreamed beneath the Canaan skies now stood before Egypt's ruler, not by chance, but by divine purpose. As Joseph spoke, his words carried more than human wisdom. There was a peace to him, a stillness that could only come from walking closely with God through valleys and storms. Each phrase fell with clarity, weaving together the truth of Pharaoh's dreams, revealing the future as God had shown it. The court listened in awe. Even Pharaoh felt that this was no ordinary man, but one in whom the Spirit of God rested. Turning to his council, Pharaoh asked softly, "Can we find anyone like this, so clearly filled with the Spirit of God?" His gaze then returned to Joseph, filled with reverence and certainty. "Since God has shown you these things, there is no one as wise and discerning as you. You shall oversee my house. Only I, upon the throne, will be greater than you." Joseph bowed his head. Gratitude welled quietly in his chest. He remembered the pit dug by jealous brothers, the years of slavery, the cold stillness of the prison. Every wound, every tear had been a step toward this moment. None of it was wasted. Whispering within, he prayed, "It is the Lord who has led me here." Pharaoh took his own signet ring and placed it upon Joseph's finger as a symbol of trust and authority. Robes of fine linen replaced the coarse garments of his past. Around his neck, a golden chain gleamed in the light. Then, with chariots and heralds, Pharaoh proclaimed Joseph ruler over all Egypt. As he rode through the city, people bowed and cried out before him, yet Joseph's heart remained still. He had once been stripped of his coat in anger. Now he was robed in honor. But in his spirit, he was the same servant of God, the same dreamer who had learned that every rise begins in surrender. In time, Pharaoh gave Joseph a new name, Zaphenath-Paneah, and a wife, Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. Together, they built a home in the land that had once been his prison. At 30 years old, Joseph began his service to Egypt not as a man seeking greatness, but as a vessel of God's wisdom. He traveled through the countryside, inspecting the fields, guiding farmers and overseeing storehouses as the earth yielded harvests beyond measure. The grain piled high, too much to count, and Joseph smiled at the thought of God's faithfulness. When his sons were born, he named the first Manasseh, saying, God has made me forget all my troubles and my father's house. The second he named Ephraim, declaring, God has made me fruitful in this land of my suffering. Each name was a testament to redemption, to the gentle hands that had turned pain into promise. Then, as the seasons changed, the years of plenty faded into famine, just as God had revealed. Across the lands, crops withered and rivers dried, but Egypt stood ready. When the people cried out to Pharaoh, he simply said, "Go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you." So Joseph opened the great storehouses. With wisdom and compassion, he distributed food to the hungry, managing the nation with fairness and grace. And as travelers from distant lands arrived seeking grain, Joseph's heart stirred. For beyond the horizon, his brothers too would one day come, drawn not by coincidence, but by the same divine thread that had woven every joy and sorrow into purpose. God's hand had never left him. Every trial, every betrayal, every moment of silence had been part of a story far greater than his own. The famine stretched like a shadow across the land, dry winds sweeping through empty fields, the sound of hunger echoing from one household to another. In Canaan, Jacob watched his sons with tired eyes. His family was growing weaker, the stores running low. Then word came like a whisper of hope. There is grain in Egypt. "Why do you stand idle?" Jacob said, his voice weary but firm. "Go to Egypt and buy grain, so that we may live and not die." 10 of his sons set out at once, but not Benjamin. Jacob could not bear to let him go. Joseph was gone. The memory still pierced him, and he would not risk losing another child of Rachel's heart. The journey to Egypt was long and solemn. Dust clung to their robes, and memories followed them like ghosts of choices made long ago, of a brother once cast away. Yet none could have imagined that the very one they mourned was the man who would now hold their future in his hands. When they entered the grand hall of Egypt's governor, the brothers bowed low to the ground. The marble floors reflected their bent figures, 11 shadows kneeling before one. And Joseph, standing above them, recognized them instantly. Time seemed to stop. The faces before him, older now, lined and worn, were the same faces that had watched him beg from the bottom of a pit. The weight of the years pressed hard against his heart. Pain, love, betrayal, and longing all rose at once. He had dreamed of this moment as a boy, the dream where his brothers bowed before him, and now here it was, not as pride imagined it, but as providence fulfilled. The ache in his chest was not triumph but tenderness. God had kept his word, not to exalt, but to heal. But the wounds were still tender. He could not reveal himself. Not yet. He needed to know if their hearts had changed. So he spoke through an interpreter, his tone calm but distant. "Where do you come from?" "From the land of Canaan," they answered. "We've come to buy food." A quiet test began. "No," Joseph said. "You are spies." Startled, they pleaded, "No, my lord. We are honest men. 12 brothers we are, the sons of one man. One is no more, and the youngest is with our father." Joseph's heart trembled at the words, but he held steady. "Then bring your youngest brother to me," he said. "Until then, one of you will remain." And for 3 days they were placed in prison, the same kind of darkness Joseph had once known. On the 3rd day, Joseph returned to them and said softly, "I am a man who fears God. Let one stay while the rest go and carry food for your families. But bring your brother back to me." The brothers agreed, but guilt stirred deeply among them. "This is our punishment," one said quietly. "We saw Joseph's distress when he begged us for mercy, but we did not listen." Reuben sighed. Did I not warn you not to harm the boy? Now we must answer for his blood." They did not know Joseph understood every word. The language of their remorse pierced through every barrier between them. And in that moment, Joseph turned away and wept. The tears came freely, not from bitterness, but from the ache of grace. He saw them not as enemies, but as men burdened by regret, still sons of the same father he loved. His heart broke, yet it also began to mend. When he composed himself, Joseph chose Simeon to stay behind. The others watched in silence as Simeon was bound, fear and confusion clouding their faces. They could not understand why this man, this stern ruler, seemed both merciful and mysterious. Quietly, Joseph gave orders for their sacks to be filled with grain. Then, in secret, he told his servants to return each man's silver to his bag and provide food for their journey. Mercy was already at work, even before they recognized it. On the road home, one brother opened his sack and gasped, "My silver! It's still here!" Panic rippled through the group. "What is this that God has done to us?" they whispered. When they reached Canaan, they told their father everything of the governor's questions, of how Simeon was left behind, and of the demand to bring Benjamin. As they emptied their sacks, every pouch gleamed with returned silver. Fear filled the tent like a storm. Jacob's voice broke. "You are robbing me of my children. Joseph is gone. Simeon is gone. And now you would take Benjamin. Everything is against me." Reuben stepped forward, desperate to restore what had been broken for so long. "You may take the lives of my 2 sons if I do not bring Benjamin back," he vowed. "I will guard him with my life." But Jacob shook his head slowly, tears gathering in his eyes. "My son will not go down with you. His brother is gone, and he is all I have left. If harm comes to him, I will go to my grave in sorrow." He turned away, his old hands covering his face. Outside, the famine pressed on, dry winds sweeping through dying crops, but inside Jacob's heart, a deeper famine raged. The hunger for peace, for the son he lost, for the forgiveness that only God could weave from so much pain. And even then, unseen by them all, God's plan moved gently forward. A plan that would soon bring healing where there had been hurt, reunion where there had been loss, and love where once there had been jealousy. Every step, every sorrow was still part of his story. A story of grace unfolding with one quiet miracle at a time. The famine had not loosened its grip on Canaan. Each sunrise brought dry winds and empty fields, and Jacob's household, once filled with laughter and livestock, grew quieter by the day. The last of the grain from Egypt was nearly gone. Hunger had a way of humbling even the strongest hearts. One morning, Jacob sat by the doorway, his eyes tracing the horizon, as though searching for an answer. Finally, with a weary sigh, he said, "Go back, my sons. Buy us a little more food." Judah stepped forward, older now, tempered by loss and regret. "Father," he said gently, "the man warned us. We cannot see his face again unless our brother is with us. If you send Benjamin, we will go. But without him, we cannot return." Jacob's face tightened with sorrow. "Why did you even tell him about another brother? Why bring this grief upon me?" Judah's voice softened. "Father, he asked about our family. If our father was still alive, if we had another brother. We only answered honestly. How could we have known he would demand to see Benjamin?" There was a long silence, heavy with the ache of remembrance. Every mention of Benjamin stirred memories Jacob had spent years trying to bury. The loss of Joseph and the long nights of mourning. But Judah's tone grew steady, resolute. "Send the boy with me. I give you my word. I will bring him back. If I fail, I'll bear the blame forever. Please, Father, if we delay any longer, we will all perish. You, our children, and us." Jacob's eyes glistened as he looked upon his sons. Once boys quarreling in the fields, now men bowed under the weight of consequence. Slowly he nodded. "If it must be so, then take the best gifts of our land, balm, honey, spices, and myrrh. Take double the money, for the silver returned in your sacks, and take Benjamin." His voice trembled, the words breaking through the pain of surrender. "May God Almighty grant you mercy before this man, so that he may release Simeon and send Benjamin back. But if I must lose my children, then so be it." And so, with heavy hearts and hopeful prayers, the brothers gathered their gifts, their silver, and their youngest brother, the one their father could hardly bear to let go. Together, they set out on the long road to Egypt once more. When they arrived, dusty and anxious from the journey, they stood again before the great halls of power. And when Joseph lifted his eyes and saw them with Benjamin among them, something deep within him stirred. It had been so many years, yet Benjamin's face carried the same gentleness he remembered. He turned quickly to his steward and said, "Take these men to my house. Prepare a meal. They will dine with me at noon." The steward obeyed, and the brothers followed in uncertain silence. Egypt's grandeur surrounded them. Towering columns, golden carvings, the scent of incense and polished stone. Yet fear gripped their hearts tighter with every step. "This must be about the money that was returned in our sacks," they whispered to one another. "He will accuse us of theft. He'll seize us, enslave us, and take our donkeys too." They didn't know that mercy, not judgment, awaited them. They didn't know that the man they feared was their brother. The same boy whose cries they had once ignored, now moved by a love that had outlasted every wound. As the palace doors opened before them, sunlight spilled into the courtyard like grace. The brothers stood before the great Egyptian palace, its marble pillars rising like towers of light under the sun. Though their faces were set with courage, their hearts trembled. They had come a long way, carrying the weight of famine, fear, and hope. And now, standing at the gates of power, they waited, unsure of what awaited them within. They approached the household manager and spoke earnestly, explaining how the silver they had paid on their last visit was mysteriously returned to them. They had brought it back, along with more for new grain, hoping to prove their honesty. The man listened quietly, his expression kind. Then he said gently, "Peace be with you. Do not be afraid. Your God, the God of your father, must have placed treasure in your sacks. I received your payment." In that moment, a soft sigh of relief escaped them. And when he brought Simeon out to meet them, the brothers embraced him, the tension of separation melting into joy. Soon after, they were led into Joseph's house. Servants came with water to wash their feet, and the weary donkeys were fed and rested. The men were told they would dine there, and as they waited, they prepared the gifts they had brought, the best of their land, offered with trembling hands. When Joseph entered, the room fell silent. The brothers bowed low, presenting their gifts with humility. Joseph's voice, calm and familiar, broke the stillness. He asked about their father, the old man they had spoken of before, and they answered that he was alive and well. Again, they bowed, their hearts heavy with respect. Then Joseph's eyes found Benjamin. His breath caught. The boy, no, the young man now, stood before him. The face of his mother reflected in those eyes. Emotion surged through Joseph, a tide he could not hold back. He blessed Benjamin softly. "May God be gracious to you, my son." But the weight of love and memory was too much. Joseph turned away, hurrying to his private chamber. There, behind closed doors, he wept. Years of separation, the ache of betrayal, and the beauty of God's unseen hand came pouring out in tears. When he returned, his face was washed, his heart steady once more. He ordered the meal to be served. The Egyptians ate apart, as their custom forbade them to share a table with Hebrews, yet Joseph's eyes remained on his brothers as they sat together. Then something remarkable happened. Each man was seated in order, from the eldest to the youngest. The brothers exchanged bewildered glances, whispering to one another, marveling at how precisely this stranger knew them. Soon the food arrived, rich and abundant, yet Benjamin's portion overflowed, 5 times more than the others. And instead of envy, laughter filled the hall. The brothers, once bound by guilt and suspicion, now shared a moment of warmth and peace. Unknown to them, grace was weaving its quiet pattern among them. What had begun as fear was turning into fellowship. Beneath the feast and the laughter, God's redemptive plan was unfolding, turning brokenness into blessing and hearts once divided into the beginnings of healing. Joseph stood at the tall windows of his palace, watching the soft morning light spill across the land. Below, his brothers were preparing to leave Egypt with their camels laden with grain, their voices filled with gratitude and relief. They were going home, yet Joseph's gaze lingered on them, quiet and thoughtful. His heart carried a longing only God could understand, the ache of love hidden beneath years of silence. Forgiveness was stirring, but before it could be complete, something still needed to be revealed. He turned to his steward and gave a quiet instruction. Fill their sacks with grain as much as they can carry. Return their silver to them as before. And take my silver cup, place it in the sack of the youngest, Benjamin. The steward obeyed without question, and by dawn the brothers set out from the city, the cool wind brushing against their faces. Their hearts were light, their journey peaceful. None of them imagined that this road home would soon test everything they had become. Not long after, the stillness of the morning was broken by pounding hooves. Joseph's steward rode swiftly after them, stopping them along the dusty road. His voice, firm but sorrowful, carried a message that froze them in place. Why have you repaid good with evil? Why have you stolen my master's silver cup, the one he uses for divination? The brothers were stunned. Their eyes darted from one to another in disbelief. Far be it from us to do such a thing, they protested. We even brought back the silver we found in our sacks last time. If any of us is found with the cup, let him die, and the rest of us will become slaves. But the steward replied gently, let it not be so. Only the one who has the cup will remain my master's servant. The rest may go free. One by one, he opened their sacks, from the eldest to the youngest. The tension thickened with each search, the grain spilling, the brothers holding their breath. And then, there it was, the silver cup, glinting from within Benjamin's sack. A wave of despair swept over them. In one heart-wrenching motion, they tore their garments, an ancient sign of grief too deep for words. The road that once led home now turned back toward Egypt, heavy with sorrow and fear. When they returned to Joseph's palace, they fell before him, their faces to the ground. The weight of years, the betrayal, the guilt, the memory of another brother sold for silver pressed upon them like a shadow. Judah stepped forward, his voice trembling yet steady. What can we say, my lord? How can we prove our innocence? God has uncovered our guilt. We are all your servants. But Joseph, still hidden behind his Egyptian guise, spoke firmly. Far be it from me to do this. Only the one found with the cup shall remain my slave. The rest of you, go back to your father in peace. At that moment, the true test began. Not of honesty, but of love. Years ago, they had sold one brother into slavery. Now, faced with the same choice, they would have to decide, would they abandon another? What Joseph was watching for was not punishment, but redemption. Through this quiet, painful test, God was writing the next line of their story. The room was silent but heavy with emotion. The brothers stood before Joseph, fearful, weary hearts trembling under the weight of what had just been uncovered. Benjamin, the youngest, stood at the center of it all, his eyes wide and uncertain. Then Judah stepped forward. His voice, though quiet, carried the weight of years of guilt, of lessons learned the hard way. He bowed low and spoke with humility. "My Lord," he began, his words measured, trembling with sincerity, "please, allow your servant a moment to speak." He reminded Joseph of their earlier conversation, how this powerful ruler had asked about their family. They had told him the truth that they had an aged father and a youngest brother born to him in his old age, that this youngest was deeply loved, for his full brother was gone, and he alone remained as a living reminder of their mother. "You asked us to bring the boy to you," Judah continued softly, "but we told you our father could not bear it. The boy is his heart. If the boy leaves him, he will die." Judah's voice faltered for a moment, then steadied again. "Yet, my lord, you said, unless your youngest brother comes with you, you will not see my face again." He recounted how, upon returning home, they had told their father every word. And when the famine pressed harder and the grain was gone, their father had asked them to go once more to Egypt for food. "But we could not," Judah said, "not without the boy. We told our father what you said, and he reminded us of his sorrow, that his beloved wife bore him 2 sons, one who never came home, torn from him long ago. And now this one. If he were lost too, the grief would be more than he could bear. It would take him to his grave." A soft silence filled the hall. The guards stood still. The brothers bowed their heads, their pain shared, their regret almost tangible. Judah drew a deep breath. His next words came like a confession full of love. "My lord, the boy's life is bound to our father's. If he does not return, our father will die of sorrow. And I promised him. I told him I would take responsibility for the boy's safety, that if harm came to him, I would carry the blame forever." He stepped closer, his eyes earnest and pleading. "Please, my lord, let me stay instead. Let me remain as your servant. Let the boy go back with his brothers. I cannot bear to see the anguish that would consume my father if Benjamin does not return. It would break his heart, and mine with it." His voice broke at the end, the kind of break that only comes from love, the love of a son who has changed, of a brother who has learned what sacrifice truly means. And in that moment, as Judah stood there, offering himself in place of another, something sacred stirred in the room. What once began as betrayal was being rewritten through love, through repentance, through God's quiet plan that had never stopped working. The test was complete. The story was shifting. Forgiveness was drawing near. The hall was still, filled with the quiet weight of held breath. Joseph looked upon the faces before him, the brothers who once cast him away, and something deep within him broke open. All the years of longing, all the tears he had buried beneath duty and power, rose to the surface. He could hold it in no longer. "Everyone, leave me," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. The attendants hesitated, confused, but one look at Joseph's tear-filled eyes sent them quickly out of the room. Soon, only the brothers remained. And then, Joseph wept. It was not a quiet weeping, but the cry of a heart finally released. His sobs echoed through the grand halls of Egypt, reaching even the ears of Pharaoh's household. It was the sound of years of sorrow meeting the grace of a long-awaited reunion. Through his tears, Joseph spoke, his voice soft, trembling, yet full of truth. "I am Joseph," he said. "Is my father still alive?" The brothers stood motionless, their faces pale with shock. The world seemed to blur around them as the truth sank in. The powerful governor of Egypt, the man who held their fate in his hands, was the brother they had betrayed so long ago. Seeing their fear, Joseph took a step forward, his expression tender, not angry. "Come closer," he said gently. They hesitated, but he beckoned again. "It's me, your brother, Joseph." There was no accusation in his tone, only compassion. His eyes, wet with tears, held no trace of bitterness. "Do not be distressed," he said softly, "and do not be angry with yourselves for what you did. You sold me, yes, but it was God who sent me here, ahead of you, to preserve life." His words fell like healing rain, washing away years of guilt and shame. "The famine has only just begun," Joseph continued, "and 5 more years still remain. But God sent me before you to save your lives and to keep our family alive." He looked at them, one by one, his voice now calm and filled with awe. "It was not you who sent me here, it was God. He made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler over all Egypt." Then his face brightened with urgency and joy. "Go quickly to my father," he said. "Tell him that God has made me ruler of all Egypt. Tell him to come down here without delay. You will live in Goshen, near me. There I will provide for you and your children, so that you will not suffer from the famine." The weight in the room shifted. Tears turned to smiles, sorrow to relief. Joseph reached for Benjamin first, pulling his youngest brother into his arms. He wept upon his shoulder, holding him as though afraid to ever let go. Then he turned to the others, each brother, one after another, and embraced them too. He kissed them, not as a ruler forgiving wrongdoers, but as a brother welcoming family home. And slowly, the silence broke. Soft laughter mingled with tears. The years of separation, the bitterness of the past all began to fade, replaced by the gentle warmth of restoration. In that moment, what had once been broken was made whole again, not by human strength, but by God's quiet, redemptive hand. The news of Joseph's brothers arriving soon reached Pharaoh's palace, and the sound of it filled the courts with joy. Pharaoh himself smiled deeply, for Joseph had long been a man of honor and faithfulness, a servant whose wisdom carried the fragrance of God's favor. With generous delight, Pharaoh sent a message to Joseph's household that his entire family should come and dwell in Egypt. "Give them the best of the land," he ordered, "a place of abundance and rest. Let them lack nothing." Wagons were prepared, strong, beautiful, and filled with gifts to bring their little ones, their wives, and their aged father from faraway Canaan. "Do not worry about your belongings," Pharaoh said, "for the best of Egypt now belongs to you." Joseph obeyed with a full heart. He equipped his brothers with wagons, food, and clothing for the journey home. Each received new garments, soft robes that spoke quietly of renewal and forgiveness. Yet to Benjamin, the brother of his youth, Joseph gave 5 robes and 300 pieces of silver, not as favoritism, but as an expression of affection too deep to hide. 10 donkeys were laden with Egypt's treasures, and 10 more with provisions for the long journey back. As the brothers prepared to leave, Joseph called after them, his voice steady yet tender. "See that you do not quarrel on the way." He knew old wounds could still whisper. But he also knew that love, once restored, could silence even the loudest echoes of the past. As the caravan moved toward Canaan, the air was heavy with thought. The clatter of wheels mingled with the rhythm of repentance. They remembered the pit, the silver coins, the hollow years of guilt. Yet here they were, redeemed by the very brother they had once betrayed. Grace had met them where shame once lived. None could speak much. Their silence carried the weight of mercy too vast to measure. When at last they reached home, they rushed to their father. "Joseph is alive!" they cried. "He is ruler over all Egypt." The words struck Jacob like sunlight breaking through years of clouded grief. For so long he had mourned, refusing comfort, believing the son of his heart was gone forever. But as his sons told him everything Joseph had said, and when he saw the royal wagons gleaming outside, his spirit stirred within him. The years of sorrow began to lift, replaced by a quiet, trembling hope. The sons who had once broken their father's heart now stood before him, humbled and changed. Tears filled their eyes as they watched the life return to his. Jacob whispered, almost in awe, "It must be true. My son Joseph is alive. I will go and see him before I die." As the caravan drew near to Egypt's borders, the land began to change. The soil grew rich, and the air carried the scent of harvest. Jacob's heart, though aged and weary, beat with a strength he hadn't felt in years. Hope was no longer a distant dream. It was waiting just ahead. Judah rode ahead, leading the way to Goshen, where Joseph had promised to meet them. Dust rose behind the wagons, shimmering beneath the desert sun, as if the earth itself rejoiced at what was about to unfold. When word reached Joseph that his father had arrived, he wasted no time. With trembling hands, he readied his chariot and set out for Goshen. The years of separation, the ache of longing, the silent prayers whispered in dark nights, all were rushing toward this single moment. And then, at last, father and son stood face to face. Joseph stepped down, his eyes glistening. Jacob, frail but radiant, opened his arms. Without a word, Joseph fell into his embrace, and together they wept deeply, freely, as though the tears themselves were washing away the sorrow of the past. Time seemed to pause around them. The wagon stood still, the wind hushed its song. It was a reunion stitched together by grace, a reminder that even what is broken can be made whole again in the hands of God. After a long while, Jacob spoke softly, his voice trembling with joy and peace. "Now I can die in peace," he said, "for I have seen your face again, and you are alive." Joseph held him closer, not as the ruler of Egypt, but as a son who had finally come home. When their tears had quieted, Joseph turned to his brothers and the rest of the family. His voice, gentle yet purposeful, carried the calm assurance of a man who understood God's timing. "I will go and speak to Pharaoh," he said. "I will tell him that my family has come." He instructed them tenderly. "When Pharaoh asks of your work, tell him you are herdsmen, as your ancestors were. He will allow you to settle here in Goshen, a good and fertile land." Joseph knew that even this detail, the place they would live, the work they would do, it was not coincidence, but divine orchestration. The day Joseph stood once more before Pharaoh was unlike any other. This time he did not come alone, nor as the servant who once interpreted dreams, but as a son and the vessel through which God's faithfulness had been revealed. With reverent joy, Joseph said to Pharaoh, "My father and my brothers have come from the land of Canaan. They have brought their flocks and all they own, and now dwell in Goshen." Pharaoh listened, his expression softening. He had long seen God's hand resting upon Joseph, and now he was witnessing the fullness of that story unfold. Joseph brought 5 of his brothers forward. They stood humbly before the throne, shepherds in simple garments within the golden halls of Egypt, a sight that spoke of both humility and providence. When Pharaoh asked about their occupation, they answered with the honesty that Joseph had taught them. "We, your servants, are shepherds, as were our fathers before us. The famine in Canaan is great, and we ask to dwell in your land for a time." Pharaoh's reply carried generosity rare among kings. "Let them live in the best of the land," he said. "Settle them in Goshen. And if any among them are skilled, let them oversee my own livestock as well." It was not mere kindness. It was divine favor flowing through human hearts, the same grace that had lifted Joseph from prison to palace. Then Joseph brought in his father. The hall fell silent as the aged Jacob entered, leaning on his staff. Time had traced deep lines upon his face, but his eyes held the calm of one who had seen sorrow turn into salvation. Pharaoh, ruler of the greatest nation on earth, rose in respect. He asked softly, "How old are you?" Jacob smiled a weary, knowing smile and said, "The years of my journey have been 130. Few and difficult they have been, yet shorter than those of my fathers before me." And then, before the throne of Egypt, the old shepherd lifted his hands and blessed the king. It was a moment that shimmered with quiet reverence. The ruler of Egypt being blessed by a man who had wrestled with God and lived to see his promises fulfilled. Jacob blessed Pharaoh once more before departing, and Joseph's heart swelled with gratitude. Every wound and every lonely year had led to this. His family was safe, his father honored, and his God glorified. Joseph settled his family in the best part of the land, the region of Ramesses, just as Pharaoh had commanded. There they found rest and abundance after years of wandering. And Joseph, ever faithful, provided for his father and brothers, for their children, and even the smallest among them. The family that had once been broken was now whole again. And through it all, the quiet thread of God's purpose continued to weave a greater story. One that would outlast them all. The famine lingered like a long shadow across the land. Year after year, the skies gave no rain, and the ground lay bare and silent. In Egypt and beyond, hunger pressed on hearts and homes alike. Yet through it all, God's hand was still at work, guiding, providing, and fulfilling his promises through Joseph, the very one once forgotten in a prison cell. As the stores of grain Joseph had gathered began to feed the nations, people from every corner of Egypt and Canaan came seeking food. The great cities that once overflowed with wealth now trembled under the weight of need. When the people's silver was gone, they came again to Joseph with empty hands and desperate eyes. "Our money has failed us," they said, "but give us food, or we will perish before your very eyes." Joseph listened with quiet compassion. He was not just a ruler now, he was a shepherd of a broken people. "Then bring your livestock," he said gently. "In exchange, I will give you food." And so they came leading their horses, their flocks, their herds. The fields that once echoed with the sound of life were traded for bread to keep families alive for another year. But as the famine endured, the people returned again. Their voices trembled, but their hearts had softened. "We cannot hide the truth from you, my lord," they said. "Our money is gone, and our cattle are yours. All that remains are our bodies and our land. Buy us and our fields in exchange for food, that we might live and not see our land desolate." Joseph looked upon them, these weary souls, once proud farmers, now humbled by hunger. Yet even in their weakness, God's mercy was unfolding a larger plan. So Joseph bought the land for Pharaoh, providing food and seed in return. But he did not leave them empty-handed. Instead, he gave them hope, a way to rebuild. "Here is seed for your fields," he told them. "When the harvest comes, 1/5 will belong to Pharaoh. The rest is yours, for your families and your children." A murmur of gratitude filled the air. Tears glistened in tired eyes as they said, "You have saved our lives. May we serve Pharaoh willingly." And so, Joseph established a new order in the land, one that preserved life through wisdom and discipline. Even in famine there was order. Even in loss there was life. Meanwhile, in Goshen, a world apart from hunger and dust, Joseph's family flourished. The people of Israel grew strong and fruitful, just as God had promised Abraham long ago. The land of refuge had become a land of blessing. Years passed, 17 of them. And in those years, Jacob saw his family restored, his heart healed, and his faith fulfilled. But as the twilight of his life drew near, Jacob called for Joseph. The room was quiet, the air heavy with memory and gratitude. "Promise me," Jacob said softly, his voice trembling with age, "that you will show me steadfast love, even in death. Do not bury me in Egypt, but take me to my fathers, to the land God gave us." Joseph knelt beside him and took his hand. "I will do as you ask," he said. But Jacob, ever the father who had wrestled with both man and God, looked into Joseph's eyes once more. "Swear it," he whispered, and Joseph swore. Then the old patriarch bowed in worship, leaning on the head of his bed. His spirit rested not on his strength, but on the faithfulness of the God who had never failed him. In that still moment, the story came full circle from betrayal to forgiveness, and from sorrow to peace. In the quiet glow of an aging day, word reached Joseph. His father was fading fast. The years had caught up with Jacob, and the time to say goodbye was near. Joseph's heart stirred. With his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, he set out toward the place where his father rested. The man whose stories had shaped his faith, whose blessings had marked generations. When Joseph entered the room, a gentle whisper spread, "Your son Joseph has come." And though weak, Jacob's spirit found strength. Slowly, he sat up in his bed, the lines on his face etched with the weight of years. But his eyes, though dim, still carried the light of a life walked with God. "God Almighty," he began softly, his voice trembling with reverence, "appeared to me long ago in Luz. He blessed me, promising to make my children as countless as the stars and to give this land to my descendants forever." He paused, looking toward Joseph's sons. "These 2 boys of yours, they are mine now. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be as my own, just as Reuben and Simeon are." There was tenderness in his tone, the warmth of a grandfather who saw not just children, but the continuation of a promise. A flicker of memory passed through him, and his eyes glistened. "When your mother, Rachel, died on the road to Bethlehem, I buried her there, with sorrow still heavy in my heart." The ache in his words was softened by time, but never forgotten. Jacob motioned for the boys to come near. Joseph guided them gently toward the bedside. "Bring them closer," Jacob said, "that I may bless them." He could barely see, yet when he felt their small hands in his own, a faint smile broke across his face. He kissed and embraced them. An old man, once a wanderer, now holding the fruit of a promise fulfilled. "I never thought I would see your face again," he said to Joseph, his eyes glistening. "And now, God has allowed me to see your children too." Joseph bowed low, his heart full. As he arranged the boys before his father, he placed Manasseh, the elder, by Jacob's right hand, and Ephraim, the younger, by his left. But Jacob, guided not by sight, but by divine wisdom, crossed his arms. His right hand rested on Ephraim's head, his left on Manasseh's. Joseph looked up, startled. "No, my father," he said gently, reaching to correct him. "This one is the firstborn." But Jacob's voice was calm, steady, and filled with knowing. "I know, my son. I know. Manasseh will be great, but Ephraim greater still. His descendants will become a multitude." Then he lifted his face and blessed them both. "May the God before whom my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, walked, the God who has shepherded me all my life, and the angel who has redeemed me from all harm, may he bless these boys. May they carry my name and the names of my fathers, and may their descendants fill the earth." The room fell silent. The air itself seemed to listen, a sacred stillness when heaven and earth meet. That day, Jacob set Ephraim before Manasseh, and a new generation stepped into the current of God's promise. As his strength waned, Jacob leaned back upon his bed, peace resting quietly upon him. He was not yet finished, but his spirit was calm, and his heart was full. The evening light rested softly over Goshen, turning the tents of Israel gold. Inside, Jacob lay upon his bed, the same man who had wrestled with God, who had known both failure and grace, now surrounded by the sons who carried his name. "Gather around me," he said, his voice faint but steady. "Let me tell you what will come in the days ahead." One by one he looked upon them, 12 men, each with a story shaped by weakness and forgiveness. To Reuben, his firstborn, he spoke with gentle sorrow, the strength of his youth once bright, yet lost through folly. To Simeon and Levi, he remembered their fierceness, praying their zeal might one day be turned toward righteousness. Then his eyes found Judah, and a quiet warmth entered his tone. "The scepter shall not depart from Judah," he said softly. And though his sons could not yet understand, a promise glimmered there, of a king who would rise from Judah's line, before whom all nations would bow. He blessed Zebulun with life by the sea, Issachar with strength to serve, Dan with wisdom to judge, Asher with abundance, and Naphtali with freedom and grace. Each blessing was simple, yet carried the weight of destiny. At last, Jacob turned to Joseph. His eyes softened. "You were attacked and betrayed," he said, "yet your bow remained strong, upheld by the mighty one of Jacob. May the Almighty bless you, blessings of the heavens above and the depths below. You, my son, are a prince among your brothers." Then he turned to Benjamin, the youngest. "Benjamin is a ravenous wolf," he said, not in rebuke, but in revelation. "Bold in the morning, triumphant by night." When Jacob's final words were fading, silence filled the tent. It was not sorrow, but something sacred, the hush that comes when eternity draws near. The room was quiet, except for the soft rustle of linen and the steady rhythm of an old man's breath. Jacob, the patriarch of Israel, lay surrounded by his sons, 12 men who had once been divided by jealousy and pride, now gathered in the tenderness of farewell. His eyes, though dim with age, still held the light of faith, the same faith that had carried him through exile and reunion. With a frail but steady voice, he spoke of the land of promise, of Abraham, of Isaac, of the God who had been faithful through every season. "Bury me," he said, "with my fathers in the cave of Machpelah." His tone was not one of sorrow, but of peace, a soul ready to rest in the hands of the one who had shepherded him all his life. His words lingered like a blessing in the air. And finally, Jacob drew his feet onto the bed, exhaled softly, and was gathered to his people. For a long moment, the sons stood still, unable to speak. Then Joseph stepped forward. He fell across his father's still body and wept. It was not just grief, but gratitude for the years restored, for the forgiveness given, and for a father's blessing that had sealed their story with grace. The brothers bowed their heads as his spirit slipped quietly into peace. Outside, the light dimmed across Goshen, and in that fading glow, one truth stood clear. What began in brokenness was ending in blessing, and through it all, the hand of God had never let go. Outside, the Egyptian sun rose over Goshen, lighting the tents where generations would one day remember this moment. Joseph commanded the physicians to embalm his father, and for 70 days, Egypt itself mourned. The land that had once enslaved Jacob's grandfather's descendants now honored the father of the man who had saved them from famine. When the days of mourning ended, Joseph approached Pharaoh's court. His words were simple, and Pharaoh's reply was kind. "Go," he said. "Bury your father, as he made you swear." So Joseph went, not alone, but with a vast procession. Chariots and horsemen filled the horizon. Egyptian nobles and Hebrew shepherds rode side by side. It was a sight unlike any other, the humble and the mighty bound together in shared reverence. At the threshing floor of Atad, beside the Jordan, they stopped. The sound of mourning rose like incense, 7 days of remembrance, 7 days of gratitude for a life that had touched eternity. The Canaanites who watched from afar called the place Abel Mizraim, the mourning of Egypt. But for Joseph and his brothers, it was not only mourning, it was worship. When the time came, the sons of Israel carried their father's body into the land of Canaan, to the cave of Machpelah. The same earth that had received Abraham and Isaac now received Jacob. The stones stood as silent witnesses to God's faithfulness. As the last handful of earth was laid over the tomb, Joseph looked toward the hills of Canaan. The wind moved gently through the trees, and in that stillness, it was as though God whispered again the truth that had guided them all along. "What I begin, I will finish. What I promise, I will fulfill." And there, between heaven and earth, the story of a family once broken by betrayal stood whole again, not by human hands, but by the hand of a faithful God. The journey back from Canaan was quieter than before. The sound of the chariots seemed softer, almost reverent, as if all creation was bowing to the weight of what had just been laid to rest. Jacob, Israel, the father of nations, had gone to his rest, leaving behind sons whose story was one of pain, forgiveness, and redemption. But as they crossed into Egypt once more, the stillness between the brothers grew heavier. Without their father, an old fear began to whisper again, one they thought was buried long ago. What if Joseph still remembers? They wondered. What if now, with father gone, he finally takes his revenge? In their guilt, they sent a message, trembling between remorse and desperation. "Before our father died," they said, "he asked that you forgive us for the wrong we did to you, for the cruelty we once showed you. We beg you, forgive us, servants of the God of your father." And when Joseph heard their words, something broke within him. Tears filled his eyes, not from anger, but from a heart deeply moved. The brothers stood before him again, as they had years ago, but this time, not as rivals. They fell to the ground, not out of fear alone, but out of the deep ache of repentance. "Look," they said softly, voices quivering, "we are your slaves." But Joseph, the brother once sold, now stood as the brother who forgave. With eyes full of compassion, he lifted them with his words. "Do not be afraid," he said gently. "Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me. Yes, but God intended it for good. He turned it into a path of life, so that many would be saved." His voice steadied, yet his heart overflowed with tenderness. "So do not fear. I will care for you and for your children." There, in the quiet halls of Egypt, grace triumphed once more. The same God who had turned betrayal into blessing wove forgiveness into the hearts of brothers once torn apart. It was never just Joseph's story. It was God's story of how love restores what envy breaks, and how his divine plan redeems even the deepest wounds. Where they took his coat of many colors, the Lord brought a throne. The brothers wept together, not as men burdened by guilt, but as sons embraced by mercy. And in that moment, the house of Israel was whole again. The years passed gently, and peace rested over Joseph's house in Egypt. The laughter of children often filled the air. Joseph, once a boy torn from his home, now watched his family grow and flourish in a land that had once been foreign. Time softened his face, but deepened his wisdom. He lived to see his children's children, even the little ones of Machir, his grandson's line, who sat on his knees as he blessed them. The man who had known betrayal and prisons now knew only gratitude. As his days drew near their end, Joseph called for his brothers, now older and gentler with the years. His voice, though frail, carried the same steady faith that had guided him through every storm. "My time is near," he said softly, his eyes filled with a quiet certainty. "But God will not forget you. One day, he will visit you and lead you out of this land. He will bring you home to the land he promised our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." There was no fear in his words, only hope, a hope larger than Egypt's treasures, resting entirely on God's faithfulness. Then he made them swear, "When God comes to lead you home, take my bones with you." He was reminding them, and all who would come after that. Egypt was never the end of their story. God's promise would endure, even beyond the grave. And so Joseph died, not as a prince of Egypt, but as a son of Israel, resting in trust. His body was placed in a coffin, but his faith still spoke, echoing across the generations to come. For even in death, Joseph believed that God's hand would one day open the way home, just as he had always done. Joseph's story did not end in Egypt. In Egypt, the children of Israel grew and multiplied, until generations later, God led them out in the great deliverance we now know as the Exodus. Joseph's life reminds us that even the deepest wounds can become the place where God's purpose is revealed. Every betrayal and every hardship can still lead to his perfect plan. When your story is told, will it speak of bitterness or forgiveness, of holding on to pain or trusting that God can turn it for good? Share your thoughts in the comments below. May God's peace and wisdom be with you and your family always. Amen.